The Admiralty told its battleship crews they served aboard the most powerful expression of British sea power in existence. That was the institutional position, carried not just in official documents, but in the full weight of a naval tradition that stretched back through Jutland and Trafalgar, and which the Royal Navy deployed as a psychological instrument as deliberately as it deployed its ships as tactical ones. The battleships, King George V, Duke of York, Warspite, were described in Admiralty publications as the guarantors of Britain's maritime dominance. The men who served aboard them were told they were the inheritors of a tradition that had made Britain the dominant naval power on Earth for 2 centuries. The battleship was the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy was Britain. The men who crewed these ships were not simply sailors. They were the living embodiment of a national identity. What the Admiralty's publications did not describe was the documented reality of serving aboard those ships in the specific material conditions the Royal Navy provided for its lower deck men in 1939, 1940, and through the years that followed. Conditions that a Board of Admiralty report from 1943, classified until 1973, described in the restrained language of official British institutional writing as substantially below the standard that the nation's stated commitment to the welfare of its servicemen would suggest was acceptable. Conditions that the men who lived them described in the letters home that the naval censors reviewed and in the mess deck conversations that nobody was recording, but that the welfare officers' reports from 1941 and 1942 reflected with the oblique precision of documents written by people who understood that the gap between what they were describing and what could be done about it was not one that any immediate action could close. The tradition was real. The ships were real. The gap between the tradition the Admiralty described and the conditions the lower deck inhabited was also real. It was not the last contradiction these men would encounter. Begin with the ship, because the specific physical character of Royal Navy battleships in the Second World War was shaped by decisions made in the 1920s and 1930s that expressed the Admiralty's priorities with a directness that the men who subsequently lived in those ships experienced as the permanent physical texture of their service. HMS, King George V, lead ship of the class that formed the backbone of the Home Fleet's battleship force through most of the war, displaced 42,237 tons at full load. She measured 745 feet from stem to stern. Her main battery was 10 14-inch guns in 2 quadruple turrets and 1 twin turret, an arrangement that reflected a design compromise between the Washington Treaty limitations on battleship displacement and the desire for maximum firepower that produced a gun caliber slightly smaller than the 16-inch weapons the Americans and Japanese were deploying but mounted in greater numbers. Her machinery plant was 8 Admiralty 3-drum boilers feeding 4 shaft Parsons, geared turbines developing 110,000 shaft horsepower, and a maximum speed of 28.3 knots. She carried a wartime crew of approximately 1,640 officers and men. She had been designed under the constraints of the Washington and London naval treaties, which imposed displacement limits that the Royal Navy's design teams had navigated by making choices that the ship's subsequent wartime service would reveal as consequential. The protection scheme was sound for the armament it was defending. The machinery plant was reliable. The fire control systems were advanced. What the treaty constraints had not prioritized, and what the design process had not made a priority in any case, was the standard of accommodation for the lower deck. The conditions under which the approximately 1,550 enlisted ratings who formed the bulk of the ship's crew would live for months at a time in wartime operations. The lower deck accommodation on a King George V class battleship reflected a Royal Navy tradition of providing for the physical requirements of the rating: a sleeping space, a mess table, a means of cooking food, a lavatory, at a standard that the Victorian naval architects who had established the baseline had calculated as sufficient for the purpose. By 1939, those calculations were approximately 60 years old. The fleet had been modernized in its weapons, its fire control, its propulsion, and its communication systems. Its approach to the comfort and habitation of ordinary ratings had been modernized in a more qualified sense. The mess deck was the organizing unit of lower deck life on a Royal Navy capital ship. Each mess consisted of between 15 and 20 men, assigned to a table and a designated space between the tables that constituted their sleeping area. The hammock, the Royal Navy's traditional sleeping arrangement, was issued to each rating. The hammock was slung from hooks on the deckhead above the mess table during sleeping hours and stowed in hammock nettings during the day. The sleeping space the hammock provided was approximately 6 feet long and 24 inches wide, with the depth of the hammock providing perhaps 12 inches of clearance between the rating's body and the man sleeping in the hammock immediately above him. The horizontal distance between adjacent hammocks when a full mess was slung for sleep was measured in inches. This was not the overcrowding that war had imposed on a system designed for peacetime numbers. The Royal Navy had been slinging hammocks at these densities in its capital ships for a century. It was the standard. The men who joined the Royal Navy in 1939 and 1940 were told that this was how naval service was conducted and that the tradition it represented was one they should take pride in. Some of them did. Most of them adapted to it because adaptation was the only available response to a condition that was not going to change. The distinction between Royal Navy lower deck service and what the scripts in this project have documented about American naval service in comparable ships is not that British conditions were dramatically worse. It is that they were worse in a specific and culturally loaded way that the American Navy's equivalent problems did not share. The Royal Navy's class structure, the formal, institutional, and often architectural separation between officers and ratings aboard its ships, imposed a hierarchy of physical conditions that expressed the Navy's social philosophy as directly as any formal statement of doctrine. On HMS King George V, the officers' accommodation was in a part of the ship architecturally separated from the rating's mess decks by the physical structure of the hull and by a social convention that was backed by regulations governing which spaces each group could occupy. Officers ate at mess tables set with tablecloths and crockery, served by ratings specifically assigned to the duty. Ratings ate from metal implements at bare mess tables. Officers bathed in facilities maintained for their use alone. Ratings shared bathrooms, heads, at ratios that the wartime complement made more acute than the pre-war design had anticipated. The captain's sea cabin and the admiral's quarters on a King George V were not extravagant by civilian standards. They were not comparable to the spaces their occupants' equivalents in the ratings slept in by any standard of measurement. The men who constituted the Royal Navy's lower deck in the Second World War did not, for the most part, describe this system as injustice in the language of formal grievance. They described it as the way things were, in letters home, in mess deck conversations, in the occasional entry in a diary that someone kept because the act of writing imposed order on what was otherwise an experience of considerable disorder. The system was too embedded in the institutional culture they had joined to be experienced as a violation of anything they had been promised. It was simply a structure they lived within and around, finding in the horizontal bonds of the mess, the 15 or 18 men who ate together and slept adjacent to each other and knew everything about each other and shared everything from food to information to the specific gallows humor that lower deck culture generated as a management tool for conditions that humor was not entirely adequate to manage, the human texture that the vertical structure of the Navy's hierarchy was not designed to provide. The class of ship that mattered most for the specific character of Royal Navy battleship service was not the modern King George V class, but the older capital ships, the Warspite, the Valiant, the Malaya, the Royal Sovereign, the Revenge, that the Royal Navy deployed from the first day of the war in every theater from the North Sea to the Indian Ocean because the fleet it had was the fleet it had, and rebuilding it was a project that would take years the war was not prepared to provide. HMS Warspite was commissioned in 1915. She had been modernized twice, extensively in 1934 to 1937, but she was still a ship whose fundamental architecture had been drawn in the decade before the First World War. Her lower deck accommodation reflected this. The ventilation systems in the older capital ships were not designed for extended tropical operations. They were adequate for the waters the ship had been built to serve, primarily the North Sea and the Atlantic. When Warspite deployed to the Mediterranean and subsequently to the Indian Ocean, she carried with her an accommodation standard designed for northern European waters into conditions that those standards were not remotely adequate for. The Mediterranean in summer, the Indian Ocean year-round. These were not abstract geographic designations. They were specific thermal environments that imposed conditions on a steel ship whose living spaces were neither insulated from the heat nor equipped to reduce it. The specific numbers that establish what British battleship service in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean meant for the men in the lower deck spaces are these. The mess decks on the lower levels of HMS Warspite during her Mediterranean operations in 1941, the year that included the Battle of Cape Matapan in March, the evacuation of Crete in May, during which Warspite was hit by a 1,000-pound German bomb that killed 38 men and wounded 31 more, and the subsequent period of repair and refit at Bremerton in the United States, recorded internal temperatures in the mess deck spaces during the Mediterranean summer that the ship's medical officer reported to the fleet surgeon as routinely exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle watch. The older ships had lower decks that sat closer to the waterline than the modern vessels, and the heat conducted through the steel hull from Mediterranean surface water, running at 78 to 84 degrees, was not mitigated by a ventilation system designed to handle North Sea ambient temperatures. Men sleeping in hammocks and mess decks at 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the Mediterranean in July and August, with the ventilation blowers circulating air that was itself 85 degrees and humid, did not sleep in any sense that the word implies restoration. They suspended consciousness in conditions of physical discomfort that accumulated across the weeks of Mediterranean operations into a physiological deficit that the ship's operational demands did not provide adequate recovery time to address. The food on a Royal Navy capital ship occupied a position in lower deck culture that was simultaneously a source of genuine complaint and a binding social ritual that structured mess deck life in ways that went beyond nutrition. The Royal Navy's victualling system was organized on a mess-based model that made each mess collectively responsible for the preparation of its own food from raw ingredients drawn from the ship's galley. The galley prepared the basic elements: cooked meat, potatoes, bread, and the mess cook, a rating assigned in rotation, collected the mess's allocation and served it at the mess table. The system had been the Royal Navy's feeding method for over a century. It produced meals whose quality varied directly with the skill and enthusiasm of the rating, designated as mess cook for the week, whose skill and enthusiasm varied across the spectrum that the random assignment of the duty to 15 different men in rotation predictably produced. A good mess cook with adequate ingredients could produce a meal that the mess ate with something approaching satisfaction. A poor mess cook with the same ingredients produced something that the lower deck's vocabulary for inadequate food, developed through generations of naval service and far more extensive than any landsman's equivalent, described with a specificity that civilian language does not match. The ingredients themselves were constrained by the same logistics that constrained every Navy's provisioning, fresh for the first week, preserved thereafter. But the Royal Navy's preserved ration in 1939 and 1940 included specific items that were so deeply embedded in the institutional tradition that they continued to appear on ships regardless of the crew's opinion of them, which was negative and consistent. Tinned corned beef, tinned herrings and tomato sauce, ship's biscuit, hardtack that traced its lineage to the provisions carried by Nelson's fleet and that had not changed substantially in the intervening century and a half, dried peas, preserved meat of uncertain provenance that the lower deck called by a name the official victualling records did not use. These items appeared in the ration because they were in the ration, and the ration was what it was, and the process of changing it was the process of changing an institution. By 1942, with the food supply chain under the pressure of German submarine operations, and the competing demands of feeding a population and sustaining 7 theaters of active military operations simultaneously, the quality of provisions reaching the fleet had declined. The decline was documented in welfare officers' reports and in the medical officers' nutrition assessments and in the letters home that the censors read, but generally permitted to pass because the expression of complaint about food was considered a normal feature of naval correspondence and was not classified as operationally sensitive information. The men ate what was available because there was nothing else to eat. They supplemented it where the opportunities of port calls allowed and where their pay, which was lower than its American equivalent at every comparable rank, permitted. The pay differential between Royal Navy and United States Navy ratings at comparable ranks is a documented fact that the joint operations of 1942 and 1943 made visible in a way that had not been possible when the two navies operated separately. A U.S. Navy seaman first class earned approximately $54 per month in 1942. A Royal Navy able seaman earned approximately £2 and 5 shillings per month, roughly $9 at the contemporary exchange rate. The American sailor in a joint port of call had 6 times the spending power of his British equivalent. The mess decks of Royal Navy capital ships understood this comparison with the precision that any group of people understands a pay disparity when they encounter its tangible expression in what the other group can afford and they cannot. The institutional response to this comparison, when it reached the Admiralty and the welfare reports that began arriving in significant volume from 1943 onward, was to note the disparity, acknowledge that it was a morale concern, and decline to address it substantially because the Treasury and the demands of the war economy did not permit it. The men continued on their lower pay, doing the same work in the same conditions on the same ships. The specific incident that illuminates what British battleship service actually cost the men who performed it, in a way that no accumulation of descriptive detail about mess decks and pay rates can replicate, is HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse on December 10, 1941. Prince of Wales was a King, George V class battleship commissioned in 1941, the most modern capital ship in the Royal Navy. She had been at the Atlantic Charter meeting when Churchill and Roosevelt had signed it aboard her in August 1941. She had fought the Bismarck in May 1941 and taken 4 hits and lost 49 men. She was 9 months old when Force Z'd, Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse, without air cover, without destroyer carrier support, sailed from Singapore to intercept a reported Japanese landing on the Malayan coast. The Japanese found them first. 85 aircraft, torpedo bombers, and high-level bombers from the Japanese 22nd Air Flotilla attacked Force Z, approximately 50 miles off the Malayan coast. The attack began at 11:13 on December 10th. Prince of Wales was hit by 4 torpedoes. Repulse was hit by 5. Prince of Wales sank at 13:18. Repulse sank at 12:33. Total dead, 840 men. Of Prince of Wales's crew of 1,612, 327 died. Of Repulse's crew of 1,309, 513 died. The specific mechanism by which Prince of Wales was mortally damaged is documented in the post-action analysis, and it reveals something about what it meant to serve on a battleship that the official position on battleship survivability had not incorporated. The first torpedo that hit Prince of Wales struck her port outer propeller shaft. The hit flooded the shaft passage and caused the rotating shaft, still turning under propulsion power, unable to be immediately disconnected, to act as a pump, forcing water into the ship's hull at a rate that exceeded the damage control capability of the spaces around it. The progressive flooding disabled the ship's electrical generating capacity. Prince of Wales lost power progressively. Her pumps stopped. Her fire control failed, her anti-aircraft guns lost power, and were unable to track subsequent attacking aircraft. She absorbed more torpedoes into a hull whose damage control organization was fighting flooding in multiple compartments simultaneously, with diminishing power and increasing water. The men in the engineering spaces of Prince of Wales during those 2 hours were doing what damage control doctrine required them to do, fighting flooding, attempting to restore power, maintaining watertight integrity where they could, in spaces that were taking on water at a rate the doctrine's procedures had not been designed to address. Some of those men were trapped by rising water and could not be reached by damage control parties. Some of them were found afterward. Some were not found at all. The survivors who reached the water, who went over the side as Prince of Wales went down, who found buoyancy from Carly floats and life jackets and whatever debris the sinking ship had produced, waited in the South China Sea for the destroyers that had been part of Force Z to find them. The destroyers came. They rescued 1,285 men from Prince of Wales and Repulse combined. The rescue operation was conducted under threat of further air attack, in daylight, in warm water. It was not a perfect rescue. It was a rescue that saved most of the men who survived the sinkings. The ones who were not saved for the specific reasons that men are not saved from sinkings. They were injured, they were trapped, they had gone down with their ships, or the time and distance between where they entered the water and where the destroyers could reach them was more than their physical state could accommodate. The lesson the Royal Navy extracted from Force Z, that capital ships without air cover and waters where shore-based air power could operate were not tactically viable platforms, regardless of their survivability against surface threats, was absorbed at the strategic level and influenced every subsequent deployment of British capital ships. The men who learned the lesson differently were the ones who came home from it and the ones who did not. HMS Duke of York, King George V class, provides the specific episode that reveals British battleship service in its most concentrated operational expression. The one occasion when a Royal Navy capital ship engaged and sank a German capital ship in a night surface action during the Second World War. The Battle of the North Cape on December 26, 1943, brought Duke of York, flying the flag of Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, against the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst in the Arctic Ocean south of Norway. Scharnhorst had sortied from Altenfjord to attack convoy WW2, the convoy that the British had deliberately set as bait for exactly this operation. Duke of York intercepted her at 1650 in darkness, in Arctic conditions, air temperature minus 10 degrees Celsius, sea state force 5, visibility poor, and opened fire with her main battery of 10 14-inch guns at a range of approximately 12,000 yards. The action lasted from 1650 until 1945. Duke of York fired 52 full 10-gun salvos. She hit Scharnhorst a documented 13 times with 14-inch shells. Each 14-inch shell weighed 1,590 pounds. Each hit produced structural damage that the analysis of the battle later assessed as progressively reducing Scharnhorst's speed and defensive capability. The final stage of the engagement involved the cruisers and destroyers of the British force launching torpedoes at a Scharnhorst that had been stopped or nearly stopped by the damage Duke of York's guns had inflicted. Scharnhorst sank at 1945. Of her crew of approximately 1,968 men, 36 survived to be rescued. The men of Duke of York who fought this action were at their battle stations for the full 3 hours of the engagement in conditions that the Arctic imposed, with a specificity that no other theater of the war replicated. The open director positions, the range-finding stations, the anti-aircraft gun positions, with their wind deflectors providing partial but not complete protection. These were occupied by men in Arctic clothing who had been at action stations since the contact report, and who would remain at action stations until the threat had been resolved. The bridge watch was exposed to Arctic wind at the ship's speed through a sea state that produced spray freezing on the bridge fittings. The fire control teams in the director control tower tracked Scharnhorst on radar and visually, calculating the gun solution for a target maneuvering at high speed in rough water and darkness. And their calculations were correct 13 times in 52 salvos, a hit rate that the Naval Gunnery School's post-war analysis described as consistent with the expected performance of a fully trained crew under adverse conditions. What the Naval Gunnery School's analysis did not extend to was what those 3 hours felt like from the inside of the 14-inch turrets, where the turret crews loaded each shell, each 1,590-pound projectile rammed hydraulically into the breech by machinery that required human operation and supervision, in a space that the guns firing produced concussive effects measured by the medical department's blast exposure studies. What it felt like from the magazine, where the propellant charges were handled and the hoists loaded and the flash doors opened and closed, with the specific timing that prevented the blast from one firing traveling down into the powder handling spaces. What it felt like from the engineering spaces, where the men on watch kept the turbines running and the boilers at pressure through a high-speed action that demanded exactly the performance their watch training had prepared them for, and that demanded it continuously for 3 hours in conditions of sustained stress that the training had replicated only in exercise. Duke of York returned to Scapa Flow, with her gun barrels worn significantly from the firing, her crew intact, and the knowledge that Scharnhorst, the ship that had been the most significant threat to Arctic convoy operations since 1941, was on the bottom of the Barents Sea. It was the clearest operational success any British capital ship achieved in the surface war. The men who achieved it received the acknowledgement the Navy provided for such things. The action was mentioned in dispatches, decorations were awarded, the official communiqué credited Admiral Fraser's force with the sinking, and then they returned to the routine of home fleet operations that the elimination of Scharnhorst simplified without eliminating. The Tirpitz remained, the convoys continued. The ships returned to Scapa Flow. Scapa Flow occupies a specific position in the geography of British battleship service that no description of combat operations adequately conveys, because Scapa Flow was where the ships were when they were not in combat, and they spent far more of the war at Scapa Flow than they spent in combat. Scapa Flow is an anchorage in the Orkney Islands at the northern tip of Scotland, at approximately 59 degrees north latitude. Its waters are sheltered from the open Atlantic by the surrounding islands. Its weather is determined by the North Atlantic climate that produces at 59 degrees north an environment characterized by persistent wind, frequent rain, limited daylight in winter, limited darkness in summer, and an absence of any land-based amenity within reasonable shoreboat distance that a sailor might characterize as recreational opportunity. The pubs were in Kirkwall. Kirkwall was accessible by boat in weather that frequently made boat operations inadvisable. When the weather permitted and the Liberty boats ran, the pubs had a finite capacity for the thousands of men from the home fleet who wanted to be in them. The majority of lower-deck recreation at Scapa Flow was recreation aboard ship. What that meant, in practice, during the extended periods when the home fleet maintained its presence at the Scapa anchorage, waiting for the German fleet to emerge from Norwegian waters, was a form of existence that combined the physical discomforts of the ship with the specific psychological pressure of enforced inactivity. The tactical purpose of the home fleet's presence at Scapa was the deterrent, the fleet in being that prevented the Tirpitz and her consorts from operating freely in the North Atlantic. The deterrent required the fleet to be at Scapa, available to intercept. It did not require any particular activity from the 1,640 men of a King George V-class battleship beyond maintaining the ship's readiness. Maintenance drills, gunnery exercises, physical training on the quarterdeck when weather permitted, and on the mess deck when it did not. Organized recreation. The Royal Navy had a formal recreation and welfare structure that managed programs of sport, entertainment, and education aboard capital ships, film shows in the hangar space, concert parties organized by crew members with musical or theatrical abilities, boxing tournaments. The activities were real, and some of them were enjoyed genuinely. They occurred in the context of an anchorage in the Orkney Islands in winter, which limited their scope. The combination of confinement, reduced activity, the persistent Orkney weather, and the awareness that the war was happening in other places to other people, while the home fleet waited for a German fleet sortie that might or might not occur, produced a psychological state that the welfare officers' reports of 1942 and 1943 documented as low morale, and that the lower deck would have described in its own terminology, with a word that does not translate precisely, but that captures the specific quality of existence at Scapa in winter with enough accuracy that most of the men who spent time there used it without explanation when speaking to anyone who had also spent time there. The cold. Not the temperature, the specific quality of sustained existence in a place that combined physical cold with the cold of enforced waiting. The post-war health records of Royal Navy battleship veterans documented the expected patterns. Hearing loss from gun exposure, musculoskeletal damage from the physical labor of the lower deck, the range of respiratory conditions associated with sustained damp and cold that Scapa and the North Atlantic produced. What the health records did not document with any comparable systematics was the psychological cost of the combination, the combat when it came, violent and lethal and often brief, the waiting that preceded and followed the combat, long and monotonous and cold, the class structure that organized life within the ship in ways the men accepted without fully endorsing, the pay that was insufficient to bridge the gap between what service required of them and what civilian life had provided, and the specific form of institutional pride that the Royal Navy deployed as a substitute for these things, asking the men to feel that their service was the inheritor of a 200-year tradition and that this inheritance compensated for conditions the tradition itself had produced. Some of them did feel this. The tradition was real, and its pull was genuine for men who had grown up in towns where naval service was a family practice across generations, where the ships in the harbor were a constant physical presence, where the Navy was the Navy, and its claim on pride was not something you questioned, because questioning it was not available as an option. Others felt it less consistently. They felt it most when the ship was doing what it had been built to do, when the guns were firing, when the engineering plant was delivering the speed the tactical situation required, when the damage control parties were containing flooding with the competence the drills had built, when the ship was, in the most direct sense, a working weapon doing its designed work. They felt at least at Scapa Flow in February, in a hammock in a mess deck at 2 a.m, listening to the Orkney wind work at the ship's superstructure. One of those men was Able Seaman George Partridge of HMS Duke of York from Devonport in Devon. Partridge was 19 years old when he joined the Royal Navy in 1940 and 22 years old on the night of December 26, 1943, when Duke of York fired 52 salvos at Scharnhorst in the Arctic Ocean. He was a member of the magazine crew for Turret A, one of the forward quadruple 14-inch turrets, and he spent the 3 hours of the North Cape action-passing propellant charges through the handling room and into the hoist that carried them to the turret above him. He did not see the battle. He saw the magazine and the hoist and the men working alongside him. He heard the guns firing through the turret structure, felt them, more accurately, as a concussion that transmitted through the steel into his feet and his chest with each salvo. He knew the battle was happening because the guns were firing and the ship was maneuvering, and the magazine temperature, which the handling room instruments monitored as a safety measure, had to be checked after each salvo series to confirm the propellant charges were not approaching the thermal limit above which handling them became categorically inadvisable. After Scharnhorst went down, Duke of York returned to Scapa. Partridge returned to the mess deck he had left before the action. He had been at action stations for 6 hours, 2 hours before the contact and 4 hours through the engagement and its aftermath. He was 22 years old. He had helped sink a German battlecruiser without seeing it. He ate the meal the galley had kept for action stations crews, which was cold. He slung his hammock and slept. He returned to Devonport after the war. He worked for 37 years as a dockyard electrician at Devonport Naval Base, maintaining the ships that came in for refit, the ships that were, in peacetime, the descendants of the ships he had served on. He retired in 1982. His son, in an account written for a Devon local history project in 2001, described visiting his father at the dockyard once and watching him pause beside a ship's turret that was being serviced with its access plates open, looking at the internal mechanism of the handling room. His son asked him what he was looking at. His father said he was checking the clearances on the hoist mechanism. He said the clearances mattered. He said that on the night of the 26th of December, 1943, in the Arctic Ocean, the clearances on a hoist mechanism very similar to this one had worked exactly as they were supposed to, every time, for 3 hours, without a single failure, and that this was the thing about the Navy that he thought about more often than he thought about anything else from those years. His son said he did not think his father was only talking about hoists. His father said he was only talking about hoists. He died in 1997 at the age of 76. He had worked beside the ships for most of his adult life. He had never spoken at length about the North Cape, in any account his family preserved, except through the specific and practical language of mechanisms and clearances, and things that worked when they were supposed to work. His family kept, in a box with his service record and his campaign medals, a photograph of Duke of York at anchor at Scapa Flow. The ship fills the frame. The Orkney sky above her is the color of February. The water is flat and gray and very cold-looking, and the ship sits on it with the specific solidity of a thing built to be exactly where it is. On the back of the photograph, in his handwriting, a date, December 25th, 1943, the day before North Cape. Nothing else,